All right, hey my fam, it's Tiger Lily. Welcome to Riddle Me This, episode 5. So the first question I have today is why the torches and pitchforks around the Utah businesses who are supposedly not being released, their names aren't being released to the public. And I just saw some anchors who were discussing basically publicly calling for the citizens of Utah to come out and call for these businesses' names to be released so that we can publicly shame them, or whatever it is that people are intending to do with the names of these businesses, which kind of seems like a very primitive approach, when not only is that just an invasion of privacy, it's an invasion of, it's essentially getting to the point where it seems like it's not enough that we have government officials who can't keep their stories straight or present information that makes sense and is accurate and that actually aligns with the studies, and they don't have the demonstrative capability of showing their science to back the things that they're saying that they're doing. But then it also now is the case where we're turning the citizens into mobs and having them snitch on each other for breaking quarantine, and having them afraid to see each other in the grocery store, afraid to connect with each other person to person, like is normal that we've been doing for eons. I mean, it's just this outrageous, like loony bin monstrosity that we are living in now. And how did this come about? We didn't design this. We've allowed them to impose this design on us, and we are going along with it. And I think that that's ridiculous. We should stop. We should not be trying to take over the supposed authority of the people who actually have the authority, the CDC, the hospital administrators, the people who are here, who are, for lack of a better word, legally tasked to deal with these businesses who are supposedly violating the, now debunked WHO's guidelines. There are people who are tasked with dealing with that. You handle your own business. There's no need for you to be calling for business owners who are probably just as stricken, just as affected as you are with this whole situation. And now we're calling to bring people out and stone them in public, so that we can make an example of them and show people what it is that will happen if you decide that no, you're not going to go along with really restrictive and oppressive and frankly inappropriate things that these now, again, debunked models were predicting and requiring that we do. So going into a little bit more detail on that, I'm going to share specifically an example that I had where I have to disclaim that this is specific to a location that I'm at here in Utah. I spoke with the Utah Health Department last week, and I asked them in regards to the information that was provided already on the website and everything in regards to what we as a business with the work that I do would be allowed to do, and what the parameters were around reopening with the May 1st reopening target guidelines. So they talked me through the different phases that they have set out and kind of outlined in terms of different timelines and different metrics, if you will. And basically it sounds like the metrics are based on the number of cases. So right there, if the metrics are based on the number of cases, and let me explain what that means. So they've set up a green phase, a yellow phase, an orange phase, and a red phase. So right now, Utah is in the orange phase, and that phase is going to come down to the yellow phase, where the restrictions will be slightly less, and you will have to do less of these draconian social engineering or psychological operation methodologies. We won't have to do as many of those in the yellow phase. And then once we have certain other metrics hit in terms of the statistics, in terms of the reporting of cases, etc., then we will move to the green phase, is the way that this is supposed to work. So I actually talked to two different people at the health department. Both of them did explain this process to me, and both of them, in explaining this process, basically hinted at, one of them said 8 to 14 weeks is she just tossed it out there as a number that it could potentially be, and she didn't specifically say that that was what it was going to be, but that's the number that came to her mind when it came out of her mouth. So that's something to be said, even though we won't hold her to that. But in terms of how long we would be here in the orange phase before moving to the yellow phase. But they both did describe that the metric is about 20,000 cases being reported per, I believe, per month here in the state of Utah that are just cases of somebody testing positive for coronavirus. Before we would move under 20,000, before we would move to the next phase, and then I don't know what the metric would be as far as how many fewer cases we would have to see on average in order to be able to move to the next phase, right? So here's the thing about using that logic to proceed to the next phase of this thing. If you are testing more people, you are going to have more tests that are coming up positive. That's the first problem I see with that logic. It doesn't make any sense. And what have they been doing this entire time? They've been pushing for mass volumes of tests. Now that May 1st is around and more Utahns are coming out of their homes, more people are going to go get tested for COVID-19. That's the way that this is going to work. If that's not the way that this is going to work, I will be very, very surprised. So if we don't see a huge spike in tests coming back positive for coronavirus 19 or COVID-19 just by the virtue of more people going to get tests, I will be very surprised. Now, I would like to know where the statistics are that they're showing us the actual number of tests that they're doing against the positives, because that would give us a little bit more context. It would give us the ability to percentage out what actually is happening, as opposed to just saying an arbitrary number of 20,000 cases or fewer, great, we move on to the yellow stage. What does that mean? If you're testing 20,000 people and they all test positive, that's a dark, dark situation, right? But then what does that mean that they're going to do at that point when 20,000 cases or fewer are testing positive? And I mean, look, there are major questions about just, again, the logic behind the way that they're setting this all out. But then you take this a step further and you understand that, specifically going back to my conversation with the health department, one of the reps I talked to, I feel really bad because I did grill her and I acknowledged it and I apologized and I thanked her for her graciousness, because it was really difficult to get answers out of her. She didn't have information that really, I think, was pretty basic information for somebody who is taking these kind of calls to be able to give to businesses who are trying to reopen in this very strange time. So what we basically found out was that the state has certain guidelines that they've set out, and that each of the counties is able to set up their own guidelines that can be either more restrictive than the state guidelines, but they cannot be less restrictive than the state guidelines, because that should be the minimal. What we were also told, though, in the same breath, is that there are many of the counties that aren't really following that rule, for lack of a better word. So questions there. There's a lot of discrepancy between what people are told. So between talking with the health department, the two people who we talked to told us, in effect, that our business doesn't qualify to open under the current guidelines because of the type of business that we are. We talked to two different people, explained the whole situation. Between those two conversations, though, the reason that we called back the second time was that we talked to another business owner who's in our actual franchise, who were completely in the same location area, in the same county rather, were told something completely different when they were in contact with the health department about whether they were able to open and what those stipulations would look like and all of that. So again, a lot of confusion. I'm not saying that it's being done for any, I'm not saying that the people that we're talking to are having any kind of issue of incompetence or they don't have any malintent. That's not what I'm saying. What I am introducing, though, is the idea that there are guidelines that are very arbitrary, and so they don't make any sense. And so when you explain it to somebody and they have to turn around and explain it to somebody else, what's happening is there's a disconnect between what people are understanding they're supposed to be doing, the narrative that we're supposed to be, the paradigm that we're under, that there's this virus and we all have to stay away from each other, and that if we don't wear masks, we're going to give it to each other, and that people who are really old are going to die, but yet somehow the people who are really young with underdeveloped immune systems aren't going to die and are not even affected by this, and on and on and on. These really, really, you know what I'm talking about. If you sit really still and think about this for yourself in your heart, you know what I'm talking about, that there are some very, very glaring holes in the plot. And if you ever watch a movie that's got a terrible plot full of holes, it's really annoying because you can kind of tell. If you decide that you're going to stay with it and just like forgive the plot holes and not worry about it, great. Ignorance is bliss, and that is a way of living that frankly I don't understand anymore, but that is your prerogative. You're allowed to decide to put your head, down and not look at this. But if you are really listening to your own intuition, most of you know that there are a lot of really like strange things that are being said and that they don't make any sense. So now why is it that even though the WHO has been defunded by the United States, publicly Trump pulled the funding, specifically because he has questions about their legitimacy, and the people who fund the WHO, not only the United States, but actually in larger part, of concern is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is not only a private corporation which shouldn't have the ability to influence our regulators. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, let me say that again, should not have the ability to influence whether you can keep your business open and under what conditions you can do that and who gets to come in and audit your business. Unless you sign paperwork with the WHO and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all of these entities that are basically driving the policy that's happening, guys, wake up. It is not actually people who are medically, scientifically backed driving the policy that is dictating your ability to move about, whether you can go to the grocery store. These are not medical professionals who are telling you this information. It's people who are privately backed, again, people who are funded by private corporations that have no ability right now to demonstrate that their science is sound. People have been calling for them to show that the science that they have, claimed to use, that the reports that they've published and said this published report is our justification for recommending that you do X, Y, and Z, make people wear masks, stay inside, all of that kind of stuff. They've submitted that kind of information as their justification for it, and it's falling apart. It's full of holes. There's no actual science in it. When you read those papers, they can't actually prove anything that they've done because they didn't do anything by the book of how you traditionally in these processes of isolating viruses to see whether they're actually the cause of certain sicknesses in people that you're testing for, all of that kind of stuff. The tests are flawed. They're not actually testing for a virus, they're testing for genetic material that most of us have in our bodies because most of us have had a cold or a flu in our lives, and that cold or flu leaves genetic material in our body, and that genetic material is usually, with a cold or a flu, going to be the coronavirus family. So what they're doing is they're showing in these tests whether or not the genetic material that's found in your lungs, if you're the one being tested obviously, is going to match what they have found in the samples that they're looking at, which again, they're looking at samples based on symptoms, which if we take a step back, I'm not going to go into that one, but there's a whole lot, guys, of stuff that we can get into, and we will be getting into that because I think that it's important, and I think that a lot of people don't know that there's so much flawed information being put out there by the mainstream media, and they think that it's actually coming from people who know what they're talking about, and it's not. Okay, the mainstream media is giving you the policy that they're meant to put into place, but if you listen to the doctors and the people who are studying this and the people who have stats now that they've actually been dealing with this, those people, that information's starting to come out now, and it is extremely horrific, and it's making me so mad. It's making me so mad that people won't talk to each other. They're putting masks on and endangering their own health. They're affecting their own business and their livelihoods by keeping their businesses closed. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Okay? I feel like if you look at it deep down, you've got to realize that there is something else going on, and it has nothing to do with the supposed virus that's going around. And here's the thing. Supposed virus, meaning this supposed reason, this supposed invisible enemy, the supposed thing that is happening, when if there is a coronavirus, COVID-19 situation, pandemic, whatever you want to, accept that they're telling you is going around, it would be really, really hard to justify any of this is going on when you actually look at the models that they used to decide what we should be scared about. The models being the computer programs, and this is the last thing that I want to say about this particular question, is the computer programs that they used they came out of the Imperial College of London, which you should look into that organization. It is a shit show, pardon my French, but they have no validity in their past, their resume is full of holes as well, basically is what I'm saying. So why did we go with this in the first place? Who knows, not to be punny about it, but the Imperial College of London did some computer programs that basically project stats, and they've done, this is kind of their thing, that's what they do. And so they were called upon to produce some stats predicting what the coronavirus spread was going to look like and what the deaths of the coronavirus spread were going to look like and all of that kind of stuff. Well, the models that they put together, they published the models, they gave the results of their models, which were projecting millions of deaths. They were projecting outrageous numbers, and that's why everybody got freaking scared, is because they saw these huge numbers that, again, were arbitrary, and they got panicked, and they've had this huge response to it. But now it turns out that not only have the model projections changed, so from huge numbers to numbers to why are we afraid of this numbers? And yet even now, those are the models that are dictating these businesses in Utah being called out onto the carpet. What? Flawed science. Now it turns out that this entire time they haven't actually produced their code for anybody to look at, the code that runs these computer models. Well, they just did, and it turns out that their code is terrible, and it reads like when you're doing code, because so in a past life I was a computer programmer. It reads like code that you write out as a draft because you have to get all your ideas out, but you're going to come back to it, and there's no way in crap you're going to publish that code because it's got a bunch of errors and extraneous characters in it, and it will probably break your system. It looks like that kind of code. These are the codes that produced the models, that produced the predictions that are having everybody up in arms because so many people are going to die. Okay, so moving right along. The next question that I have, guys, is why is it now that apparently New York is reporting that hospitalizations for coronavirus are overwhelmingly now sourced from people who just came off of quarantine? So I have a few thoughts on this. I'm going to explain what is basically being said here. Now it is the case that people who are coming in and getting tested for coronavirus in New York, they did a study. I don't remember how many hospitals. I believe it was 100. Don't quote me on that. But those hospitals submitted data that shows that the overwhelming majority of people who are testing positive now, coming into the hospital and being testing positive, specifically hospitalizations that are testing positive, are being reported now as having just come from quarantining. So it begs the question, okay, so if that's the case, then does that mean that this whole thing was completely flawed and we probably shouldn't have done it, because no matter what we did, people who were staying home were going to get it anyway or test positive for it anyway? Now here's the thing, let me back that up. Test positive for it anyway or get it anyway? That's the question. Why are they testing positive for it? Does that go back to the flawed nature of the tests? Does it go back to we all actually had this exposed to us anyway? There are a lot of questions about why that would be, and I think that there are a lot of potential explanations about why that would be. Now, I think that a lot of the people, like I said, a lot of people who are coming out of quarantine now are going to go to the hospital to get tested. And so I think it should also be looked at whether those people are actually all reporting or presenting with symptoms, like whether they're actually sick when they get there or whether they feel fine. Now, there's also some information coming out that, again, with the actual thing that's happening to people is not that they need to get more oxygen into their body because their muscles aren't pulling enough oxygen into their body. The problem is that on a cellular level, they're not actually able to uptake enough oxygen. The saturation of oxygen in their blood is not high enough, which basically is not an issue of put a ventilator on them, intubate them, and make them, help their muscles pull air in. There are a number of doctors who are coming out explaining this issue, that they're seeing that people are actually being killed being put on ventilators because they don't need ventilation, they need an increase in their oxygen saturation. It looks like high altitude sickness, which results in that ground glass opacity x-ray that we're seeing in the symptoms of people who are presenting with coronavirus. So again, going back to this overwhelming majority of people coming out of quarantine, going to the hospital to get tested, and boom, they have coronavirus. Is it the case that they're all showing up, hey, I feel sick? Or is it just the case that they're showing up and they're presenting with these other now like weird symptoms that we're hearing about, which include that hypoxia that resembles, the high altitude sickness symptoms. People are showing up to the hospital, not actually showing up feeling sick at all, but they have blue lips. They have really low oxygen saturation. Doctors are confused as to why they're sitting up and talking to them when scientifically, biologically, they probably shouldn't be feeling that way. Just perfectly fine sitting up and talking when their oxygen saturation is what it is. So these are questions that we should be asking because, again, this is not being discussed in the mainstream media. What we're hearing about is the ventilators because Trump is like, don't worry, I got all the ventilators I needed. There's a lot going on here that doesn't have anything to do with what they're telling us it does, and I think that it's important that we keep watching these specific stories as they continue to unfold. Okay, so and the other thing that we should remember, though, about this whole situation is that this is going to happen everywhere. It is going to be the case that as people come out and they're not stuck in their homes, they're being exposed to each other. They're being exposed to all of the pathogens and everything that's coming out now that it's springtime. So who knows what, kind of compounding issues allergies are going to have on what I'm about to talk about. But then in addition to that, we've got people who have been suppressing their immune system because that's not the way that the immune system is designed to stay strong. It's not designed to stay away from potential attackers. It's meant to be around potential attackers and try to be as strong as it can in and of itself so that when those potential attackers come in, it doesn't have to spend bandwidth trying to defeat the attackers. It just learns what it needs to do, pivots, creates some antibodies, and then boom, off you go. Guys, again, I'm not a virologist. I'm not a biologist. I'm doing a lot of listening to people who have very impressive credentials, but I'm also just asking a lot of very basic questions based on what I do know, based on what I have learned, based on the certification that I have, based on basic human anatomy and physiology. These are not rocket science questions, and again, if you think about it really carefully, I guarantee there are some of these questions that you've asked yourself, that you have, friends and family that are discussing these topics, things that you may not have thought about, but that are maybe in your heart. These things that make you queasy, things that are in your heart that are kind of in the background, that you hear something and you're like, I don't know why that makes me feel weird. Don't ignore that feeling. My third question is going to be a little bit quicker because I think I'm just going to put it out there and invite you to kind of think about it. So General Flynn was, the charges that were filed against him were dropped today. Now this is a very, 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 very old story. So why is it coming up now? The interesting thing about this timing is that coronavirus and the quarantine and everything like that wrapped up on May 1st, right? So that first season, if you will, of that whole drama wraps up on May 1st, but it was a huge boom. Nobody expected it. It came out of nowhere. It's like one of those shows that drops on Netflix and it's an instant. Everybody's talking about it. It is ridiculous. Nobody understands why it was just instantly huge, but it is. It was a huge thing that took the entire, and guys, take this with a grain of salt, my analogy that I'm choosing right now, but go with it for a second, okay? So we couldn't quite wrap our minds around it. It completely captured the entire world. And now, May 1st, it wraps up. We're kind of easing off the brakes a little bit. People are going back to work. There's still some fuss in the ethers and everything like that, but there are a lot of other things that are now starting to take the main stage. So if coronavirus is in the off season, and Michael Flynn, which is a huge story, and if you saw my video the other day where I talked about dog whistles, this is probably, if any other whistle, this is the one. This is the one dog whistle that Trump could possibly be blowing right now, or that, Trump's administration could possibly be blowing right now, to take our focus away as a society, basically in the mainstream in the United States, to take the focus away from coronavirus and put it onto something else. And my belief is that the something else is Russiagate. That the information about Russiagate is starting to pop off now. more so in the mainstream media. It's being a little bit more drug up with some urgency and with some finger pointing and with some saber rattling and some aha, we've got you. And there are some really interesting things that are coming out that are being released for the first time, kind of unveiled, like, ooh, new information, it's a bombshell document, this is the kicker, hook, line, and sinker. Well, one of those got Michael Flynn's charges dropped today. So it begs the question, what's coming next? What's the next chapter? Or what's the next, thing that's going to happen? Again, I think we should look at the Russiagate story. I think we should look at the China did it coronavirus narrative, where it is, again, there's a lot of information that's coming out about the coronavirus narrative in regards to where it started and whether China had anything to do with it, and whether the United States had anything to do with it, and whether Fauci had anything to do with it, and whether Trump had anything to do with it. Although, let's not forget that Trump and Obama both had Fauci under their administration, and he was doing this under both of their administrations, so shouldn't they both have something to do with it? All of these questions are going to start coming up this week, and if you're paying attention, you're going to notice some interesting things. I think probably also about China and their involvement in all of this. And I'm predicting that nobody is going to understand what's happening again, because remember, back at the beginning of this whole shenanigan with coronavirus, nobody understood what was happening. There was so much just going off at the same time that none of us could keep up with it enough to figure anything out. And it's only now that that's wound down and has been kind of effectively shelved for a second, that now all of this information that we could have had back then, if we had been able to get some clear answers from the people who were supposedly in charge, that's coming out now, and it's demonstrating that all of the things that we just went through that basically traumatized an entire world, all of those things were based on lies, manipulations, private motives, and we let them do it. I think if we don't pay attention to what comes next, we're going to find ourselves in an unimaginable place, given that round 2 is going to definitely hit harder than the first one. I think as a last little tidbit to look up or to think about is watch Venezuela as well. Between Russiagate, between what, we might as well just call Chinagate or Coronagate, I don't know, and then Venezuela. There are very, very strange questions that I have about the narrative that just came out about two former Green Berets who have some connections to Trump and his former security detail, and who were arrested having brought 300 men to commit a murder of the president of Venezuela, when the United States has been for months now trying to get that guy out of office. And now suddenly these guys who have connections to Trump and specifically state that they're super proud that they've been sent there on a mission to overthrow the government of Venezuela on behalf of the United States government. Interesting things coming, guys. There are questions. I don't know whether we're going to find all the answers. Again, it may not be for a long time before we get even a modicum of enough answers to even keep us sane about everything that's going on right now. But you are probably in shock. Even though this thing is wearing off, most people are feeling a little bit of anxiety in their bodies somatically. We've just been through something that's completely unprecedented. So take a second and think, what if we do ask some questions about what just happened to us? Maybe it'll prevent something worse from coming down the pike. Like, share, subscribe this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave us a comment below. Follow us at united.vibration on Instagram, and go wake some unicorns, guys. Peace, my fam.